they with us? No.
No, Karina's working today, so she
Oh.
will be.
Okay. Well, we got some more people back. A reading from the Gospel of Mark. On leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. They immediately told him about her. He approached, grasped her hand, and helped her up. Then the fever left her, and she waited on him. When it was evening, after sunset, they brought to him all who were ill or possessed by demons. The whole town was gathered at his door. He cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he drove out many demons, not permitting them to speak because they knew him. Rising very early before dawn, he left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. Simon and those who were with him pursued him, and on finding him said, "Everyone is looking for you." He told them, "Let us go on to the nearby villages, that I may preach there also. For this purpose have I come." So he went into their synagogues, preaching and driving out demons throughout the whole of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord.
Okay, so here we have a continuation of last week's gospel, which it kind of clues us in when it says on leaving the synagogue. So we just heard that story last week. So what stood out to you? What comforted you? What challenged you? Yeah.
So much people were really different about this story is that his mother is just ill. You know, she's probably she just, you know, maybe she's got the flu or something. She is in the classic Mark makes a picture of those who are ill or who possessed by demons. They aren't necessarily interchangeable. And I think that's very comforting to know that Jesus is concerned about us in all of our states, you know, whether it's just have a regular illness or whether it's us, you know, it's not just it's both.
And he has compassion for her, and he approaches her. It's physical. He grasps her hand. So there's a real physicality to that healing.
I find it interesting. It says that he cured many who were sick with various diseases and drove out many people. It didn't say he cured all of them, he drove out all of them. I wonder if many is all. Many, it's many, and some of it from church.
Maybe some didn't believe. I wonder if that, that's when you hear things like that. Is it a belief issue on the part of the person? Because many times that he heals, he talks about your faith and how that your faith has healed you. Yeah.
Although, in our lives, there are times when you can pray your heart out and still don't get that feeling that you're looking for. So, no. Yes, I think cure us of everything.
Yeah. And yeah, he never promised the life was going to be a bed of roses. In fact, it says a couple of times in scriptures that he will wipe away our tears. So he'll walk with us through these sorrows. And I always think it's those times when we are in despair and our prayers aren't answered that we grow. Because God's answer isn't necessarily no, but not now, I've got something better in mind for you. So that maybe the thing you're praying for isn't the thing that's going to be best for you or the thing that's going to advance the kingdom.
So the use of the word many is what, it's not used lightly.
I didn't hear you. What'd you say?
This is the use of the word many, instead of all, or instead of some. It said some, yeah, okay, you understand that he cured some, that leads you someplace else. But just many, he cured many, he didn't say he cured them all. And so that there's apparently a lot more behind that. And I was able to see it. Out.
Karina's joined us if y'all went away.
Let's try to get this a little bit as far as not Bible study, but they didn't start bringing him people cured. He cured the mother-in-law, but they didn't bring anybody else until after sunset. So this was the Sabbath. He left the synagogue. People didn't want to fight for the hierarchy, so they waited until after the Sabbath to bring people to cure, run out, chase out demons. Anyway.
Because traveling, other than going from your home to the synagogue, was considered work. You didn't work on the Sabbath.
Okay, it's been my experience that God does heal, I mean, all. And maybe, maybe at that point he heals many, but, and it was real obvious for me with Cricket because, I wanted her healed my way, but God healed her his way. And, before she died, she said, we always win our battle with cancer. We just win one way or another. And so, I think we have to be careful, or at least I have to be careful of dictating to God how I want him to heal, and because he didn't heal my way doesn't mean he didn't heal. And so, and sometimes the best healing he gives me is no.
And for you to see her faith and her understanding at that moment in time was a blessing for you.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And still is. So I get scared when we say that God didn't heal, because that's his job. I mean, that's what he wanted to do. That's why he made all of us, is to heal us, to bring us into him.
And so just because he didn't heal them there in that time, in that moment, in a way that other people could see, does not mean that he was not working in their lives. Yeah, Michael.
Everybody's looking for you. Like, it kind of seems like you gotta get out of here. Everybody's trying to find you. Jesus says, like, well, let's go find them because that's why I'm here. And it's just funny to think about, like, even Jesus's closest followers, like, we gotta get out of here. And Jesus is like, guys, no, this is the reason why I'm here. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so that sense of purpose that Jesus had. And you notice this happened after Jesus had gone away to be in prayer. Where were the disciples? Were they in prayer too? It doesn't tell us. Doesn't tell us where they were. Were they out yucking it up with their friends? I don't know. And so there we see the importance of staying in prayer and having that quiet time like we talked about last week. Again, this week we see again. So when you hear repeated themes like this in the Bible, here we had in last week's reading, which immediately precedes this one in the Bible, and again in this week's reading, that he goes away to pray. And so again, we see that importance of silence and silent prayer to be in union with God according to a purpose. Because sometimes when we say God doesn't answer prayers, part of the purpose for prayer is for us to be in union with God and what his will is, and to align ourselves to his will. So when things like that don't happen in the way we want it to, that's kind of, okay, I need to, it's a growth opportunity for us to let go of our own stuff and open ourselves up to God's. Because, when you're holding on to something like this, someone's trying to give you something, you can't take it. You need to open up and let go in order to receive those gifts and graces that God wants to give you.
You can make mine way more.
Sometimes that happens, you know, you can't articulate it and someone else says, oh, it's like this. You go, yes, that's what I meant to say. Happens to me all the time, you know. Did y'all go to 9 o'clock mass? Okay, with Father Dean's homily today. Was that not wonderful? Yeah. And I like that he is challenging us. He talked about being evangelizers, basically. He made a comparison between St. Paul's conversion and St. Paul's recognition that he was on a mission to share Christ with everyone. And you know, you got to admire St. Paul. He was bold, he was knowledgeable, he wasn't afraid to, you know, say the tough things. But he talked about because of our baptism, we also were called to that. And this is something you guys hear me say all the time, that by virtue of our baptism, we are called to be priest, prophet, and king along with Christ, as co-heirs with Christ in the same offices that he held as priest, prophet, and king. To go out there and teach others, to guide others, to pray with others, to facilitate that, and to be Jesus in their lives. So he said it much more eloquently.
One thing that I heard him say is that it was in a question, like, we already are a billboard for God. Now, what kind of billboard do we really want to be?
Right. Yeah, and that was kind of the challenge that he made at the mass I went to, was if you were put on trial for being a Catholic Christian, is there enough evidence to convict you? And, you know, he made that point that there are things that happen in our culture that if we don't stand up against them, we're complicit. You know, are we participating in gossip? Are we upholding the dignity of every person and affirming people instead of tearing them down? And just things like that can happen in our everyday lives. So, you know, are we standing for sacramental marriage, which we'll talk about today? Are we visiting those in prison? Are we feeding the hungry? Are we setting that example that people expect of Christians? And none of us are perfect, and we all have different calls. So while I may be called to teach, that may not be what you do, but the point he made was by your example, people are going to pay attention to how you live your life. And I see so many people come through here because they knew Catholics who had that peace and that joy and were kind and stood by them when they went through a tough time. You know, all these things, what I hear is that's what attracted them to the Catholic faith. And as Catholics, we do have kind of a different worldview. And you may see it, you may not, but there, you know, the point is that people should see that in you. People should see that you're different from the world. So yeah, it was a good challenge, and you know, being in faith formation as a ministry, you know, it's music to my ears because that's why I'm here, to help people, get people formed in their faith so they can be more effective as disciples. And one of the things that we talk about is being an intentional disciples, because there's a lot of people that go to church, and they go through the motions, but they're not on the mission. They're just going through the motion. So we want you to be on the mission. And we'll talk today about how that can play out in marriage and family life. which is the most common place where it happens, because guess what? You know, we were all children at one time. We all grew up with other people caring for us, whether they were our biological family or not. We were all raised in some sort of family. And most of us will go on to have children and raise a family, and then hopefully be grandparents and have that extended family, extended support. There are also those who are called to single life and have more time to give to the greater community. So that's something we're going to talk about today. Anything else on the gospel? Okay, well, let's dive in. Okay. So what do we think we know about marriage? What does the culture tell us? John's got that look like, don't get me started. Oh.
So the answer, the unspoken answer was.
It is a new story every day. But today, so much of what we learn about marriage, we learn from popular culture. You know, we learn from Ellen, who has a same-sex relationship, or did, I don't know. Or Oprah, who's in a relationship without marriage, as we tell. We learn from, you know, Kanye and Kim. We absorb this stuff. You know, they're not out there preaching about marriage, but we observe it. And because, you know, these media figures are so prominent in our culture, that as we come up in this culture, that's where we get a lot of our information in marriage. And of course, now there's all this stuff about this talk about same-sex marriage, which has been legalized, and there's a lot of conflict over that. So hopefully today, what I want to do is look at what God's plan for marriage, what's God's definition for marriage, and how can we reconcile some of that with what's happening in the world today, and should we? So, I put a quote here from the Catechism, and it's also in your USCCA that I gave you. It says, the vocation to marriage is written in the very nature of man and woman as they came from the hand of the Creator. Marriage is not a purely human institution, despite the many variations it may have undergone through the centuries in different cultures, social structures, and spiritual attitudes. So here the church is recognizing that over the years, the way people look at marriage has changed. And it's really undergone in our lifetimes a definite change in our society here in the United States. But as Christians, we know that marriage is a vocation. And we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the call of Samuel. In Catholic parlance, it used to be a vocation was you're going to be a priest or a nun, right? And then with Vatican II, they expanded that and they're like, no, everyone has a vocation. You know, we are all called to the common priesthood to be priest, prophet, and king like Christ when we're baptized. So that's the common priesthood, but some are called to the ministerial priesthood. So to be priests or deacons. So that's a call, and there's, you know, times in your life where that changed. So you may have that vocation to be married. Once you're married, you may have a vocation to be a parent. Some people feel like they have a vocation to be a parent, but they're not blessed with children. So they have to kind of reorient themselves to, okay, that wasn't God's plan for me. So now what can I do? So we see marriage as a vocation, something that God calls us to do. So there should be a period of discernment about, am I being called to marriage? And if you feel like God's calling you to marriage, then it's like, who am I supposed to marry? You know, so there's that secondary, okay, I feel I'm being called to marriage. And I know some young people who really have seriously discerned, am I being called to go into a religious order? or am I being called to marriage? And they felt like they were being called to marriage, but it's been quite a few years and no one has shown up. So it can take a while. It's a process, and that process prepares you. In the resources today, I shared a video from Jackie and Bobby Angel. And if you watch that video and look them up, Jackie has a really great vocation story because she's one of these that waited a very long time. You know, and she said that every nice Catholic guy she met, she thinks, is this the one? Is this the one? And it took a while. And now she's married, and it's a beautiful story. And I put it in there for y'all to watch. And they have 4 beautiful children. When they did the video, they only had the one, but they have 4 now. So it's just really a beautiful story. And she and Bobby have they just moved to Dallas to work with Bishop Barron's Word on Fire organization. She's in charge of their family ministry, domestic church ministry. So marriage is a vocation. And we say there are 4 essential elements for marriage. Marriage has to be free, total, faithful, and fruitful. And these elements reflect Christ's love for us. You'll often hear Christ referred to as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. So this is reflected in the wedding vows as well. So I made a chart because I'm very visual. I like to see that kind of thing. So when someone gets married, there's 3 questions that they're asked by the minister. The first is, have you come here freely and without reservation to give yourselves to each other in marriage? So this addresses both that being free and total, that you're freely giving yourself and you're giving yourself to each other totally. And this reflects Jesus giving himself completely unto death for us. And he didn't withhold anything. You know, he did say, if this cup could be taken with me, I prefer not to suffer, but I love you enough that I will suffer this and endure this for you. So that's the first 2, free and total, in that first question. The next question is, will you love and honor each other as man and wife for the rest of your lives? So that's talking about being faithful. You know, when Christ loves us, even when we turn away and sin, he still loves us. So that's the example of faithfulness. And then the third question is, will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? So this is fruitful. Be fruitful and multiply. And when we look at Christ as an example here, Christ's death gave birth to the church. That's why Jesus was here. Yes, he died for our sins, but he came to establish a church for us so that we could be united with him and bring others to him. So then the next part is actually your declaration of consent, you know, where you say, you know, I take you to be my wife or husband. I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. And the priest follows that with a blessing. Declare your consent. May the Lord in his goodness strengthen your consent and fill you both with his blessings. What God has joined, men must not divide. And there's several different rites, so there's a little bit of variation, but this is the basic stuff. So this declaration of consent emphasizes that exclusive and indissoluble nature of marriage and that bond between husband and wife. And marriage is the only sacrament where the priest or deacon is not the minister of the sacrament. The husband and wife, the couple, are actually the ministers of the sacrament because it's a covenant between the 2 of them. So the priest or deacon is a witness. So unlike other sacraments, for example, when you baptize your child, you have the priest or deacon and then you have the godparents there. When you get married, you have the couple as celebrating the sacrament. You've got the priest as a witness, but then you also have to have two other witnesses. So you have to have more witnesses for marriage, and this is because it's public. Marriage is a public covenant. You're making this covenant between the two of you, but it's public because it involves the community, because you're creating your family community. There's an impact there. As the body of Christ, you're declaring that you are a couple, you're being married. And then after that, you have the blessing and exchange of rings. So the priest blesses those rings. Says, grant that those who wear them may always have a deep faith in each other, and that do your will and always live together in peace, goodwill, and love. And then as they exchange rings, they say, take this ring as a sign of my love and fidelity. So the rings, the circular shape of the ring, it symbolizes that unbroken promise. It's a single piece that is unbroken. And so it represents the never-ending love. It represents that unbroken promise. There's a bunch of symbolism here, and you can go online and look at different things. But this ring is a symbol of your love for your spouse. So if you ever have a fight with that ring, and okay, gotta take care of this. And so I've been talking about marriage as a covenant. And a covenant is different from a contract. Because a contract is like a business relationship. You do this and I'll do that. Marriage is a covenant. It's a relationship between two people. And it's a covenant that you're going to love this person for a lifetime. So it's very serious. It's not just a civil contract between two people. And one of the most important things about this covenant is that Christ has to be the center of it. So one of the things I read about the symbolism of the rings is that hole in the middle is to be filled by Christ. St. Augustine famously said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so that's, he read a long time ago. And that's still true, I've heard it said that we are spiritual beings living in a material world. So we long for that spiritual to fill our hearts, because as wonderful as your spouse is, they're not going to be able to fill every empty place in your heart, and that's reserved for Christ. So he has to be at the center of your marriage, and only Christ can fill that hole and bring you peace. That's not your spouse's job. Your spouse's job is to help you get to heaven. So to remind you that Christ is part of your marriage. And so praying with your spouse is very important because it opens you up, there's vulnerability, and you don't often see how your spouse is praying for you unless you pray together. So you affirm your spouse in prayer. You ask for special blessings on your spouse. You ask for help with maybe something they're struggling with. And you open up and ask for help for yourself. And your spouse may not recognize that you're struggling with something until they hear you ask out for help in prayer. And yes, you talk to your spouse, but there's just some things that don't always come out of the benefit. So it's very important in marriage for God to be a big part of that. And I have some resources here I wanted to share with you. They're in the list back, but Fulton Sheen, you can tell this is a vintage book. He's venerable. He should be canonized really soon. I think his canonization got delayed by COVID. But he was very popular back in the 50s, had a television show, and It was like one of the most popular television shows back then, which is hard to believe now. But so he wrote this 3 to Get Married and talks about the importance of having God in your life. Y'all remember Fruit Machines? See, so even the non-Catholics watched it. He had a real gift. He was the Catholic media bishop before Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron was the guy, of course, probably likes those years. And then this next quote that I have is, it's from Scott Hahn's, The First Society, referring to marriage, Sacrament of Matrimony and Restoration of the Social Order. So one of the points that he makes is that marriage is the first place where we learn about society and societal roles. And the quote here says, marriage is not just the first society, but also its transfigured and divinized form, the last society. It is the form and fundamental unit of all human societies, universal metaphysics, precisely because it is the earthly analog for divine communion. It is the universal interpretive key for understanding our experience and our nature, because it is the interpretive key for understanding our relationship with our Creator. It is the most fundamentally and undeniably human relationship, because it is a reflection of a participation in the divine relationship among the persons of the Trinity and the citizens of heaven. A perfect and eternal communion of persons. So he's a university professor, and it can be kind of difficult to understand, but what he said here is very profound. When we think about the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one of the things we say about that is that the love between the Father and Son is so complete, so profound, and so total, that it actually creates another person in the Holy Spirit. So that Holy Spirit is the person created out of that love. So when you take that analogy to the marital relationship, the love between the husband and wife, when they come together in love, creates another person and their children. So it's in that family unit where the child sees that love between their parents, that begins to understand relationship and begins to understand God and relationship with God. So that horizontal relationship that you have in the family as a child grows can become that vertical relationship with God. Does that make sense? Questions? It's very profound, but that that relationship of the family is primary to everything else we understand in our life. Yeah, and everyone these days says, oh, marriage has to be 50-50. And no, that's not the way it works. Marriage has to be 100% on both parts, both people. It's in it for me.
Yeah, regardless.
Yeah, and that's something that people don't often talk about when they're talking about marriage, is that self-sacrificial component of it. is you're agreeing to go into this relationship, giving it your all. And yeah, there's going to be times where there's an imbalance. You know, if someone's sick, obviously, there's things they're not going to be able to do. They're not going to be able, their 100% when they're sick is not the same as their 100% when they're healthy. And so their spouse is going to have to, you know, give more at that point. But the person who's sick is still giving 100% of what they can give at that point in time.
When you were talking about vocation, last of my life, I grew up with the definition of the vocation as meaning a career choice. And when I went through our CIA, I heard people talking about vocations and electricians, professors, what's the deal here? And it never occurred to me that marriage or the priesthood could be considered a vocation. And I think that's a challenge that we have in our society, is just realizing that to take it seriously like we do when we choose a vocation, a professional vocation. You know, even through high school, we have vocational training, and we have guidance counselors that meet with all the kids to help them discern what their vocation is going to be, but we spend so little time as a culture helping anyone to determine what this vocation is going to be. And I think that's probably where a culture gets in so much trouble, is because it's not taken seriously. We should have seriously as what we do. I'm not sure. Shape.
Yes, we're in love.
I always look up words just to make sure I'm. And vocation comes from the word vocare, to call. Okay, and it says that it's our main occupation, regarded as worthy and requiring dedication.
And there's different levels of vocation. You know, we have this life vocation, but we also have a career vocation. And that's where, you know, the charisms that we get from the Holy Spirit come into play. You have a charism for healing, for teaching, for administration. You know, there's a bunch of different things that you can be really good at and be called to do in your career. So, you know, there's vocations on many levels. But to see your marriage as a vocation, you know, it's a primary vocation because it's lifelong. Lifelong.
Church that takes it that seriously. Where it's not just a sacrament, you know, it is considered a religious.
Yeah, so it's very important to understand that sense of vocation and that sense of self-sacrifice, and you know, it's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be fun. That I'm in love feeling it's going to wear off for a while, after a while. And you know, part of this, that last, or one of the four elements that we talked about was being fruitful. And this is often, you know, it's kind of easy to understand. Yeah, okay, I get it. When you're married, you know, you're supposed to be faithful. Yeah, we get that. It's part of the culture. You know, okay, I get that, you know, I got to give fully to my spouse. I'm not sure I understand how to do that, or that's going to be really hard, but I understand why that's important. You know, sometimes it can be murky of, are you free to give your consent? Because sometimes, you know, especially if you're cohabitating with your fiance, it's hard to separate all that stuff after you know, combine finances and bills and things like that. Or even if you're not cohabitating, if you get close to the wedding and you find out something about your fiance and you're like, this is a deal breaker, it's hard to break that after you've made all these plans and are going to disappoint a bunch of people that they were coming to your wedding. So, you know, sometimes the freedom to marry. You know, if you're pregnant, getting married because you're pregnant. So for all these reasons, this is why the church teaches what they do about that sexual union being reserved for the sacrament of marriage. And you know, that's why the Catholic Church asks us to go through these trainings with not trainings, but preparation, marriage preparation, that where you can explore different areas and get a little bit of information on conflict resolution. What are the major pressure points in a marriage and how to navigate that? Because we don't always have a good example at all. So the Catholic Church is serious about it, and they're trying to help couples. They're not just making you jump through hoops because we want to make you jump through hoops. We're really trying to help you understand what marriage is really about and what it's going to take, and make sure you're going into this with eyes wide open and you're free to make that decision. And you're willing to give yourself completely and fully to that person. And you know what it means to be faithful. But it's when we get to fruitfulness that people in our culture sometimes have difficulty. Okay. So it's when we get to that fruitfulness that we sometimes have difficulty because we are so accustomed to contracepting and delaying pregnancy. And when we say be fruitful, that means in your marriage to be open to life. And this really came to a head in 1968. Pope Paul VI published an encyclical called Humana Vitae. And there had been this big synod, and a bunch of people had recommended to the Pope that he allow artificial contraception. And he said, absolutely not. And he made 4 predictions on what would happen if this became commonplace. And it turned out, you know, this was over 50 years ago, turned out to be really a prophetic document, because he said there would be an increase in sexual infidelity and a degradation of sexual morality. Well, we've definitely seen that. I mean, it used to be, before this document, less than 7% of children were born out of wedlock. Now it's 40%. And those numbers are really skewed when you get into minority populations. I think for the African American population, 70% of children are born out of wedlock. So it really hits those who maybe are on the fringes or the lower socioeconomic tiers. Those are the people that it hits the hardest. The other thing he predicted was husbands losing respect for their wives as persons and for women in general. And I think we see this with the objectification of women, the prevalence of pornography. We see this all over the place. I was watching some vintage TV made back in the 80s, and it was bringing back things to me. In the 80s and 90s, you know, there was a big media thing about rape, the rape of women, and how, you know, it was just so prevalent. It was, you know, in this TV show, and I was remembering back, oh yeah, I remember, you know, my aunt cautioning me, oh, don't go out alone at night, the mad rapist will get you, you know. And, you know, something like that wasn't talked about before, and talked about because it was so prevalent. And then in the 90s, when I was a young woman here in Austin, I used to volunteer with what was then the Rape Crisis Center. And we would go out to the high schools and talk about date rape because it had become such a problem. You know, the young men did not believe the no when they heard the no. And it was a big problem. It probably still is. I'm not in that field anymore, but so, you know, that really is something. The other thing, he said the government would impose population controls for contraception, sterilization, and abortion, and we've seen that, especially in the poor countries. People go to these third world countries and say, oh, here's contraception, so you won't have all these kids. And the other thing he predicted was a mistaken human concept of absolute dominion over your own body, and that includes procreation. So, this sex has become like a sport instead of an intimate union between two people. So these are some things, and one thing I think that is very prevalent that isn't in this list. We talked about men losing respect for women, but women have also lost respect for men. And I see that as a big problem because men aren't taught how to be men and be the providers. And, men are treated like goofballs. Oh, don't pay any attention to dad, And that's not right. That's not right. Men and women need to respect each other. So there's a mutual disrespect between men and women that has come about as a result of the ability to contracept and this, to some extent, the feminist movement. There are good portions of that. We don't want to, throw everything out the window. I think, there have been great strides in women getting respect that they deserve, but sometimes it goes too far. So we need to be very cautious about respecting everyone. And, rich or poor, no matter what no matter what their vocation is in life, Do you know the name of your custodian at your job? Do you, how do you treat your waiter when you go out to eat? Probably not going out to eat these days, but you get the idea of being respectful of everyone. Because, we're all just doing the best we can for the most part. And we need to respect where other people are. You never know why they're there. So that goes a long way. And Pope John Paul II wrote a series of homilies that have become known as theology of the body. And this focuses on that unity between man and woman. And he also wrote a book in the 60s called Love and Responsibility. And I think his theology of the body built on what he wrote there. But he discusses marital chastity, so chastity within marriage, which I think is very important, responsible parenthood. And he wrote several documents during his papacy that focused on families and marriage. Familias Consortio in 1981, Veritatis Splendor in 1993, and Evangelum Vita in 1995 are three of the major ones. If you'd like to look them up on the Vatican website, go for it. It's kind of tough reading. I find John Paul II to be a difficult read, and I don't know if it's the translation or if it's the way he wrote, but it's stuff.
Our selection was love and responsibility, but my husband, a former philosophy major, was the only one who could really get through John Paul II's love and responsibility, because it wasn't a translation issue. It was because he addresses things with very philosophical minds. So he defines things over and over and over again in that big circle. And so the rest of us, couldn't handle that. And we took the Edward Street, best version, and went through that. But the interesting way it happened was and admittedly, all I read was the Reader's Digest version, but but John Paul II talks about
And I'm gonna talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
And Susan, did you wanna?
Oh, yeah, Christopher West was another author who adapted. Sorry. What's on Paul's. His, theology of the body to.
There are several courses now based on that, and there's a Theology of Body Institute. Yeah, there's a lot of information now on that. But one of the things that's come a long way as far as natural family planning is what we call it, is using a woman's own body and signals to know when she's ovulating and to make a decision. Are we open to a child right now? Yes, the woman is fertile. And to know when she's not fertile, so it's not as much a concern. But the key is, either way, you're open to life when you do have intercourse. So there's the natural family planning has gone a long way. I'm starting there. There are several different methods. And for those of you who are older, I'm sorry. But there's several different methods of natural family planning. And as science has advanced, we understand why they work, and they're much more effective than what used to be called the rhythm method, where you assumed every woman had a cycle that was the same length. So, if you abstained these days, you were fine. Well, not every woman has the same cycle length. So every woman's fertile times are going to be different, and they're likely going to be different every month. Some people are like clockwork, but there's always those times when you're sick or there's a stressor in your life and things are going to get a little bit off. So there's several different ways that you can do this. One has been around for a very long time. It's called the symptothermal method, and that's using your basal body temperature, taking your temperature every morning, charting it, and you get trained in how to watch your cycle and know when you're fertile or not. Another method is a mucus method where you track your mucus during the day, and I'm not going to get into that. To determine. And then the Creighton method, the Billings method, there's several methods that revolve around those. And you can use those in conjunction. You can do both if you like. And then there's a relatively new method, and this is the one I'm primarily talking to people about now, called the Marquette method. And I've got some brochures up here. We have a gal here at our church who's a trainer for this, an instructor. This uses those clear blue ovulation strips. And it's once a day. So especially for you younger folks, this is like the easy way. Check it once a day, put it in a little machine, mark it down, you're good. And there's so many apps on your phone now that you can use. When I was doing this, I had these paper charts, those little stickers that had babies on them or not babies on them. So now there's this, and we do offer on the third Tuesday of every month a free introduction to natural family planning. It's in the bulletin. If you're doing marriage prep, that's something that you're asked to do as part of your marriage prep. Watch that introduction. You have to be a medical professional, like a nurse or a doctor, to be an instructor in the Marquette method. So she goes through and she tells you, gives you a biology lesson on how this all works. And so that's something that if you're going to be getting married, that we would like to introduce you to. These methods are just as effective as hormonal birth control pills when used correctly. But I have a cousin who has 2 children because she did not use her birth control pills correctly. So there's always that. Yeah, there's a lot of health issues that can come with using hormonal birth control pills. Natural family planning, hey, it's organic. You're not doing anything bad with your body. You're learning more about your body. And so what that tells you is you learn about when you're fertile, and when you're not fertile. And women, you're the one who determines whether you're fertile or infertile. Men are fertile all the time. Okay? So what this does is it makes you talk about it. You know? And so you know, okay, this is my fertile time. Are we open to having a child right now? May not happen, but are we open to it? But recognize that even in your infertile times, that it's always a possibility because weird things happen. But it is very effective. And the instructors can, you know, tell all about it. Not my job. Pat and John don't need to hear about that. I waited when I remarried. I was 50 years old, and my stepdaughter said, "It'd be okay if y'all had another child, because she's an only child." I'm like, "Oh, sweet, that ship has sailed." But every time there's a reading in Mass about, you know, someone praying for a child like Sarah or Hannah, in their old age, they've been married for years and they have a child, Elizabeth, this is looks at me and I'm like, remember they were praying for a child, that ain't happening here. So my fear is that he's praying for a child. So yeah, people say it doesn't work. Well, I have 2 children, both born in February, because their dad and I both have February birthdays. We love our children that all have February birthdays because we thought that would be cool. I don't know why. And we have 2 children, exactly 4 years apart. Their birthdays today. So 30 years ago, I was in labor with my first, and 26 years ago, I was in, no, I actually had this born early in the morning. She was born at 9. So today is my children's birthday. I won't see either of them. They're off. They're getting cookies. Just treats. You know, I was like, okay, I'm going to deliver those early in the day because it's Super Bowl. It does work. We lost one in between that would also have been born in February as well. So it does work. You can't always time it. You know, you can't, obviously, you've got to have your body's cooperation. You can't always time it precisely because, you know, sometimes you lose pregnancies. I lost several along the way. That just happens, but it is very reliable method, and it forces you to talk about, hey, are we open to having children? So for you guys, you get to know your wife's body, and the instructors will help you talk about, you know, what you do if you're not ready to have a child, and you know it's your fertile time, and you don't want to be intimate. So they talk about all that and give you tips. So that's something, especially for those of you that are young and childbearing age, that you know, you really should carefully look into. Okay, questions on marriage. We've covered a lot of ground. Like everything, we're just kind of hitting the high points.
I was so surprised. By Genesis. And
And when you look at particularly John Paul II's theology of the body, he spends a lot of time in Genesis and looking at the 2 creation stories. You know, one of them says that he created them male and female, and then the other one says that woman was created out of man. But both of them indicate to us that complementarity of male and female, and that unity, and that one flesh union that was intended from the beginning of creation. So it all starts there, and John Paul II just does a deep dive and talks about all the implications there. Yeah, I was afraid I'd get off in the weeds, so. Yeah, and so we see in the garden before the fall, you know, they were completely free to love each other, and it wasn't until after the fall that there came the pain of childbirth and the division that happened because of that. So you know, we're broken people, still are. We have the grace of God to help us, and that's why Christ has to be in your marriage, and that has to be a part of your marriage. That's why it's difficult to have a sacramental marriage when one person is not baptized. Now these two, I don't know how y'all did it. Yeah, and so that might be something fun for y'all to do after you're baptized, John, is to convalidate your vows, because as a baptized person, and you know, 50 years, that's a good time to renew your vows, right?
Yeah.
When's your anniversary? So you're coming up on 50 years, or you just celebrated 50 years? Okay. Yeah. So that might be something fun to talk about doing. Outdoor weddings. Okay, so the church canon law says that as a baptized Catholic or as a confirmed Catholic, that you should be married by a priest or a deacon in a sanctuary. So on holy ground. And so you can't like have a beach wedding or anything like that, which causes some problems these days. You know, a lot of people want to have a destination wedding or an outdoor wedding, but it is a matter of canon law. Now you can have a dispensation to be married by another minister, or you can have your wedding convalidated. Most fancy term for redoing your vows in front of a deacon or priest with witnesses, of course. So that's, I know a couple that had a small wedding in the chapel and then went and did a renewal outside of whatever that they want. The thing I'm surprised didn't come up was the same-sex marriage.
We don't know the answer.
Okay, let's try. Yeah, so, you know, it's difficult when we know so many people in our lives who are attracted to the same sex and do want to have this love in their life. God, our Creator, created us to be in a relationship, but when it comes to that sexual union, He created that for marriage, for the good of society, like the Scott Hahn book was talking about. You know, it's the first society, it creates the basic unit of society. So when it comes to same-sex couples, just like unmarried heterosexual couples or polyamorous couples, they're not able to have that one flesh union that creates that sacramental marriage. So there's a lot of information about there. If that's something that you're struggling with within your family. But some of the things that can be bugaboos is when you say, hey, I support traditional marriage, then you get a lot of blowback on traditional marriage. So the preferred term is talking about conjugal marriage, because that focuses on that one flesh union that you have between a man and a woman in a marriage. So we love our family members who may be in same-sex relationships or polyamorous relationships or other things that aren't in God's plan for marriage. You know, God's plan for marriage is for our best. He created us. He knows what's best for us, but we live in a broken world. And there's going to be people in our lives who are not in sacramental marriages, who are in other kinds of relationships, and we still need to love them and support them to the best of our ability. Now, whether you go to the wedding ceremony or not, I've heard two different schools of thought on that. One is no, let them know that you love them, but that's not your idea of marriage and you're going to opt out. Others say you love them, let them know that, where you disagree, but that you love them and you'll be there to support them. So I've heard both. So that's a personal discernment that you can make based on your relationship with that person. If it's someone really close to you and your family, a sibling or a parent or whatever, that's going to be a little bit more difficult than if it's, don't go down the street. So it's, we recognize, they're in that civil union sometimes to get the legal benefits, but ultimately, the difference between a conjugal marriage that is sacramental in the church's eyes and a same-sex marriage, which is relational, is that there's not that ordering towards the life of the family and of the children. So marriage came about to provide for children, right? So if there's no possibility of having biological children, a civil contract, a civil marriage is adequate for whatever they need, but it's not a marriage, a sacramental marriage as we understand it in the Catholic Church.
Should say about civil unions, I know that, even heterosexual couples have to go to the courthouse and get a legal document and a marriage license that says, but does the church recognize civil unions as being kind of over there and something that doesn't need the blessing of the church, that is still legitimate, or?
We recognize it as a legal reality.
Even for homosexual couples?
It's a legal reality. It's separate. The state recognizes a marriage in the church as being legitimate. Right. So the state is the one that recognizes marriage because the state has a stake in it. Because if there's not a marriage to care for the children, then the government winds up paying more money to care for that child, right? If you've got a single mom, she probably needs government assistance to get by for a while. So it's in the government's best interest to encourage marriage for the sake of the children, because it's less expensive than paying someone. I read somewhere sometime that if you had to hire people to do what a stay-at-home mom does, it'd be like $120,000 a year that you would have to pay people to do all the things a mom does for her children. So the whole idea of marriage in society is that marriage is ordered towards the care of the children, so that you have two biological parents caring for the children, which is in their best interest. Because once folks get divorced and there's step parents and boyfriends, girlfriends in the picture, the incidence of abuse goes up and the mental health of the children goes down. So best case scenario is two parents in a loving, low conflict relationship caring for their own biological children. Obviously, there's adoptions and things like that happen. People are widowed. There's a bunch of variables, but the best case for the kids is living with their biological parents who are in a low conflict and dedicated relationships. It used to be, it was, you get married and then you have kids. It kind of gets turned around these days. Well, we do the best we can. We live in the world and we do the best we can. So the church loves everyone. If someone comes in and wants to baptize their child, we're gonna work with them to the best of our ability. We're not gonna make them jump through too many hoops. If it's a Catholic married to a non-Catholic and they weren't married in the church, as long as they intend to raise the child in the church, that's our primary concern for the child, is that they within the church. So if grandma comes and said, hey, my kids aren't going to church anymore, I want to baptize my grandchild, we really can't do that unless the grandparents are actually raising the child. The parents aren't in the picture.
You started off talking about questions we have about marriage that coming from society. And I think over time, and when you hear marriage now, or when I got married, it seems that now there's more of a sense that this is a pinnacle achievement that you're working toward, or if I need to get to school, or I need to have a job, and check this off and this off before I can get married. I was thinking earlier today about my parents, but especially about my who had really wonderful memories of struggling as a young couple. They got married earlier, and they had to grow together. They had to work on things together. And I think that really cemented their relationship. And now it's like, well, one autonomous being and another autonomous being in marriage together, like parallel. But what my mother and father-in-law had was so much richer.
There's a lot to that, it's good to know that you're able to support a family before you start one. But there's something to be said for growing up together
And the
struggle.
Yeah.
And I know my sister went through that. She married a young man that was in the Air Force. And so we moved away from family, with his first assignment. They were hundreds of miles away. Family was in Texas, they were in Boston. And they had their 2 children there. And it really forced them to come together as a couple because they didn't have anyone else. So that was kind of nice. Of course, way back when, people didn't move away from home, so you always had aunts and uncles and mom and dad and extended family all around. And that's how I grew up. I never had a babysitter. I did, but they were all family. If my grandparents couldn't watch us, we'd go over to aunts or uncles or even great aunts and great uncles. So I was probably closer to some of my great aunts and uncles than a lot of people are to their grandparents, because I saw them all the time. They'd babysit us on the rare occasion that my parents went somewhere without us. It just didn't happen very often. So, there's something to be said for that too, to be having that extended family, but especially nowadays where people don't tend to have that because we move around so much. It's very helpful to bond as a couple. And it's the older you get, you're right. You have your separate lives, you have your own ways. And, I got married at 50, and it's, he had his way of doing things, and I had mine. And sometimes it's a struggle. Some things, you just got to decide what's important and figure out a way to talk about the rest. So. Okay, well, I'm going to close this.